Hello and welcome to season 2 of the Book Tribe podcast. And this season, we're interviewing even more subject matter experts for their insights on how to build an authoring business. And in this first episode, we're talking about podcasting as a mechanism for authors to build brand, cultivate a following, and potentially also generate additional revenue. And to help me navigate this topic is Sarah Moffat, wife and soon-to-be mum, congratulations, non-fiction ghostwriter, podcast manager, and creator of the Podcast to Blueprint mini course. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you today.
Oh, I'm so pleased because I think when it comes to podcasting, it's become a really popular medium of connecting with other people, talking about topics in general. Could be business, could be books, whatever. And I think a lot of authors will be interested to know how they can actually leverage this as part of their business. But before we get into it, we're going to start with one bookish question. Last season it was 3, but we're going to cut it down to 1 this time. And the question is, you are deserted on an island with only 3 books. I know this is a horrible question, but what 3 would you bring?
That is not a fair question.
I'm so sorry.
So, goodness, I would have to say, let's dabble a bit, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to go with I Am Aussie. I don't know why. I've read it multiple times and I find it entertaining. So Desert Island, I'm going to go I Am Aussie.
Mm-hmm.
Green Lights by Matthew McConaughey.
Wow.
And I'm probably going to say Shadow of the Wind, because I'll bring a fiction book with me because we all need some fiction in our lives.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
I think those are the first 3 that popped into my head, so that's what I'm gonna go with.
That's such a eclectic, that's the word I'm looking for, eclectic mix. But I think for me it would all be fiction. I'm a fiction person through and through. I've read my fair share of non-fiction, but it's the fiction that gets me. It's the stories where I can escape and go into worlds that don't actually exist but sound a lot of fun. So thank you for answering that question. It's nice to see what people suggest and what people's favorite books are. But let's get into podcasting, because I suppose for authors there's 2 avenues, and we're going to talk more about one, but there's 2 ways in which they could get involved with podcasting, which is either as a guest on someone else's podcast or as a host of their own program. So do you think it's possible for authors in general to leverage a podcast as a host? Because I guess being a guest is already a possibility, but do you think that it's possible for them to host their own show?
Absolutely. And I see it like you just said, nonfiction. I see it a lot more in nonfiction. However, I think there are opportunities for fiction authors to dive into that hosting space, and because you don't see a whole lot of it, there's also that opportunity to really go in and nail it and hone in on that market. So absolutely.
Yeah, I guess the first thing would be to ask you, what should they be considering when it comes to thinking about hosting their own podcast? Like, where do they even start?
Right. So I've thought a little bit about this from a fiction author perspective, and it would all come down to your audience, right? Knowing who you're writing for, who you want to pick up your book and read it, who you want tuning into your podcast. So before anything, really know who you're talking to and what you want them to take away from it before you even consider grabbing the mic and recording your episodes. Really think about, almost like when you're going back to writing your book, who are you writing it for? So you want to take that into consideration when you're starting out on a podcast or starting a podcast.
Yeah. And my question then is, well, if they go, okay, my target audience is this, then what's the podcast going to be about? I don't know if you've had any thoughts as to what fiction authors might be able to actually talk about, what the story is that they might want to tell on their podcast.
Right. So what I've thought of, and it would be different for everybody, of course, but starting out by even asking your audience, like, hey, I've thought about starting a podcast. What would you like to hear from me? So you're already getting that feedback, knowing exactly what they want to hear from you. And then you can plan your content around that. But off the top of my head, without doing any market research or anything, you could obviously talk about your book, but what inspired your book? What is your writing process? Maybe diving into the characters a little bit. What inspired the characters? How do you navigate world building? There's all sorts of different avenues that you could take it. And you could also do like poll your audience and find out like a question and answer session. What questions do they have that you could answer? Or you could even expand a little bit and bring other authors or other people in the fiction world onto your podcast and have some interviews. So I feel like there's a lot of opportunity that's kind of untapped right now.
Absolutely. And actually the topics that you were kind of mulling over there, I was thinking, well, there are activities and content that authors are already planning out for their social media and across those channels. So actually this is offering another channel, perhaps, and we can talk about kind of revenue building in a bit, but perhaps an exclusive podcast for their followers, which is giving them a bit more of a deep dive into that process and giving them more of a sneak peek behind the curtain. So I think, as you say, there's quite a few things that they can do that they're sort of all doing already. So when it comes to the beginning stages of building a podcast for beginners, what are the essential steps that they should follow to kind of set up their podcast for success?
Right. So we've already talked a little bit about that with knowing exactly who you want to be creating your podcast for and creating the content around that. But the more technical things, I feel like that's where a lot of people get hung up, where they start thinking they need the $200-something Shure mic, when the reality is the mic that I have cost me under $100. It's a very high quality mic. So you don't have to invest a lot and you don't have to get hung up on what mic. Just get something and start. But I would say invest in a mic and invest in headphones. Even if they're inexpensive, you can grow, but just don't get hung up thinking I need the biggest and the best in the studio. And no, just start. There's ways to do it. And then there's obviously hosting platforms that you need to look into, and a lot of it is a roadblock for people because there are so many options and it's what's the difference. And I would say a lot of them are comparable. It's just a matter of what's important to you. So the big ones are Podbean, Buzzsprout, Captivate. The thing I like about Captivate is they have the opportunity to host a private podcast, which you kind of touched upon in our last question. So it really all depends on, what your needs are. I like Buzzsprout for their analytics and their customer service. Some people swear by Podbean, so it just takes a little bit of digging. But again, don't get too hung up because you can always switch hosting platforms down the road if you're not happy with the one that you chose.
Yeah, and I just think for our audience, perhaps, I mean, having run this podcast and others, I'm sort of familiar with, hosting and, the different distribution programs. But what does a hosting platform help them to do?
So your hosting platform is basically when you record your episodes, that's where you upload it to. And then from there, that distributes it out to the Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the streaming services. So really the hosting platform, it's not a huge deal. It's where your podcast lives. That's where you set it up with your cover art, your description, your podcast title. That's where you upload all of your episodes and just distribute them from there. So it's really not this huge, like, oh my goodness, this is a life or death decision. Just go with one. That's where your podcast lives. And then if you're not happy with the analytics, or if you want to look into that private podcasting, you can always change your hosting platform.
Yeah, and I guess the only thing that authors will perhaps consider, if they've got a website of their own, perhaps a WordPress site or something that they have, is should they host it on their website or host it on a hosting platform? And I don't know about you, but from my personal experience, I'd be like, well, hosting platform, because you can get that distribution, and also you get more data usage. Like on your website, you're hosting the data just as much as you are, putting it onto your website. So I don't know, maybe that's a choice that they have to consider as well, host it on their website or host it on a hosting platform.
Yeah, absolutely. And it depends on, are they actively using their website to try to generate traffic, either for their book or their business or what have you. So it's just something to look into and see what's right for you.
Absolutely. I thought that was just good for us to talk about, because I'm not sure if people know that, there's different ways of doing this. Because as well, when I first started doing podcasts, I just started uploading it to Spotify for podcasters. But actually, having been through the process a few times now, I was like, actually, there might be a better way to do this, which means that I get more people to see my stuff on Apple, on Google, and it's a lot easier, actually, from my own experience. So what do you think the biggest challenges that people might face when launching a podcast?
I think a lot of it is what we just talked about, that getting hung up on all the nuances of, do I need this equipment? Do I need that equipment? What hosting platform? Will anybody listen to it? How do people listen to it? There's a lot of getting in your own head about it, but sometimes you just need to take that leap and just do it. Put it out there. Take messy action and learn as you grow.
Yeah, I've been through that journey, certainly. So, and also, when we start to talk about investing in a podcast, we then start to think about budgeting. Now, we've already kind of mentioned that you can get some decent mics and headphones that aren't going to cost the earth for. But are there any other kind of costs that you would suggest authors or people who are starting a podcast should consider? Because I know that through my own experience with Podbean, there's different tiers of how much you can do on a hosting platform. So what do you think would be a reasonable amount for someone starting off to invest into their podcasting?
Right. So there are free hosting platforms, but they have limitations. So some of them will only host your episodes for, I believe it's 90 days. But you don't necessarily want that if you're trying to grow your author platform and grow your following. You don't want your episodes to start dropping off and people can't go back to the beginning of your journey. So there's always limitations with the free ones. The hosting platforms, they have the certain tiers, like you said. Typically, I find the middle tier seems to be like the sweet spot, where they're still offering you exactly what you need, but you're not limiting yourself on how long you can upload and that sort of thing. So cost can vary, and I don't know off the top of my head, but it's anywhere from, what would you say, probably $9 or pounds up until maybe 24. So you're looking at the hosting platform fee as, I would say, a non-negotiable. I mean, if you have to go the free version, then there's nothing wrong with that. Everybody has their own budgets. But if you're looking to get into podcasting to grow your audience and grow your platform, then definitely consider the paid hosting platform. So there's that. There's a headphone and mic, which again, they don't have to cost an arm and a leg. They don't have to cost over $100. You can find some in that $50 range, even less than that. I would say there's Canva, obviously, to do your own cover art, but there are options to work with cover designers who will design your cover art for you, or a slightly less of an investment. They have podcast cover templates that you can buy and work with. And then obviously there are people like me who are podcast managers who help people launch their podcast. So it can range from a couple hundred to if you're working with a podcast manager, it can go up into the thousands, but it's really an investment in you and your business and your platform. So it's all dependent on people's needs.
Yeah, and as you say, there's so many different pieces that someone might want to bring into it. So, for example, we record these on Riverside, the kind of recording and editing platform, and that in itself has a cost monthly. So, there's different pieces like that where if you're really looking to execute a professional looking and sounding podcast that comes underneath that. But for us and our guests, we also invite our guests to go through a bit of an onboarding process with the online form that we ask you to complete, and that process is on an online form kind of tool, which means that we can collect the data and we can go back to it and it's all there, but that's free. And there are paid versions obviously, but actually just to fulfill a process, the free version does exactly what we need. So yeah, there's loads of different things that you might need if you want guests, if you want to have the editing done to a good standard with captions, all of that stuff, then yeah, there's loads of pieces, as you say. And so let's start to talk about the elements of a podcast that really make it successful, that make it good to listen to, that is engaging for listeners. What would you say are those key elements that really make a podcast do well, if that makes sense?
So one of them you just touched on is editing. And I know that there are people out there that like it raw, or people that maybe editing feels intimidating, so they say, I'm just going to upload it and get it out there. But one of the biggest things that I've come across is poor audio quality is one of the major reasons why people drop off from listening to a podcast. So for me, that's one of the big ones that makes a successful podcast. It's okay to keep it raw, but I would go through and try to clean it up as much as you can. And again, it doesn't have to be 4 or 5 hours spent on making it sound pristine, but you just want to think about your end user and their experience. What are they listening? Are they listening in their headphones? Are they listening in their car? Is the music going to be too loud? They're just that to me is one of the biggies about what makes a successful podcast. And it's maybe something you wouldn't think of, but for me, that's what I found being in this industry, is that poor audio quality is really kind of a make or break for listeners. I don't know if that's what you have found as well.
Well, yeah, I think for the podcast that I've done previously, there was a phase of not having like a proper mic, and we were recording on Teams rather than a proper podcasting site. So the quality of the audio was really shocking, and just to listen back as I was going through and editing it, I was like, oh, that really hurts my ears. And it can be grating, it can be annoying, it can be off-putting. And so I agree with you, the editing piece and the quality piece is a good place to kind of put some emphasis on, I think, because then people are like, okay, they're really putting some effort in here, like the production value is higher, so
Right.
worth listening, you know what I mean?
Right.
And is there anything else that you think kind of points towards a well-produced, engaging podcast?
So I would say everything hinges upon that foundational work of your content. Is your content providing value for your listener? Taking the time to read your listener reviews and feedback and taking it on board. Don't be offended by it. Just take it on board and implement it if it's something that can be implemented, because that's who your podcast is for in the long run. So I would definitely say that your content is a big one for success, and consistency. That's a big one, because if your audience doesn't know when to expect to hear from you, how can they expect to tune in every Tuesday at X time, whatever time you choose to release at? So I think those are some of the big ones for me.
Yeah, and as you have pointed out previously about the analytics, like that's also quite useful to have when you can go back and start to think, okay, so what are the times that my listeners are actually listening? So, for example, for us, it's Tuesdays and Saturdays. So it's good to know when they're going to be listening, so that you can hit them when they're there. And when it comes to kind of building that following, someone's started a podcast, they've got a few episodes under their belt. What kind of things can they be doing to encourage people to subscribe, to follow the content, to continue to listen? What kind of things might you suggest they consider?
I would say in their episode and show descriptions, have a call to action where your listeners can connect with you. Where are you most active? Is it on Instagram? Is it your website? Is it Facebook? Is it elsewhere? Definitely have that call to action so they know where to connect with you outside of your podcast. And if they are connecting with you outside of your podcast, if you're promoting your episodes, if you're teasing your episodes, if your listeners are leaving comments or engaging with your stories, always take the time to engage with them back. That's definitely an important part of growing that following. It's relationship, it's authenticity. They want to know you, and they're taking the time out of their day to tune into your show. And not only tune into your show, but engage with your content. Take the time back. That's what I would say.
I think that's such great advice. And I think the other part to that is, they might already have a following on Instagram or on TikTok or wherever it is. And so, there's already an audience there. So it's almost tapping into what already exists,
Right.
Starting with that, and then continuing to reward, as you say, that time that they're giving you with good content, with good quality, podcast sessions that they can enjoy and feel that they're getting, something out of it as well. And yeah, it's really fascinating. It really is, because you just think actually podcasting can also be, as you said, a relationship builder. It can, yes, find new audiences and, community members within an author's community, but it's also an opportunity to give them back something that perhaps is special. So let's start to talk about then these kind of different ways an author could, or someone, doesn't have to be an author, but we are talking about authors, could leverage a podcast for perhaps revenue, because there are lots of options out there in terms of ads and kind of building subscription only channels or podcasts. What are your thoughts around this? Where does someone even begin to consider how to turn it into a revenue stream?
There are so many different avenues, and it all comes down to your goals. And is your podcast part of your business? Do you already offer a coaching program? Do you already offer a digital product that you can use your podcast as leverage to funnel these current listeners or new listeners into your program or content that already exists? So there's one avenue. But then, like you said, there's also opportunities for ads and sponsorships. But if that doesn't sit well with you, if that's not really your thing, there's something like we talked about earlier, the private podcasting, where it's basically like a membership only or subscription only, where you give them extra content that doesn't exist elsewhere, that it's exclusive to the private podcast membership or subscribers. There's obviously merchandise like your book or other products. There's so many different avenues that you can pursue, even as simple as a buy me a coffee or a Patreon. So it really comes down to why you're starting your podcast and what your long-term goals are to figure out which avenue would be right for you.
Yeah, and as you say, I think it really comes back to the goal. It's the story you're telling and the goal that you're trying to achieve through this. If it's more people buying your book, then that's the objective. If it's I don't know, in some way generating an additional monthly income through subscriptions, then that's slightly different. It's not selling a book, it's selling another product. So yeah, I think it's something that maybe authors haven't considered, is that this could be revenue generating for them as well.
Right. And as you were saying, if the book is the goal, there's also those opportunities because you're building a speaking platform, so you're getting the experience speaking. There's also that opportunity to open up doors for speaking opportunities to speak about your book, which would in turn give you opportunities to sell your book. So it's not just limited to book sales, it's opportunities around that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to talk about the marketing piece. With podcasts and having a channel, people are going to want to know, where do I begin to market this? And I wondered if we could talk about that a little bit in terms of what you've seen happen, maybe not necessarily authors, but what other podcasts have done to market their podcast to improve their following or their subscribers and listeners. What have you seen as successful when it comes to marketing a podcast?
So I'm sure you've seen short form content. Definitely those Instagram Reels, the YouTube Shorts. That's a very popular means to promote your podcast. And as we talked about at the very beginning, the two avenues, hosting or guesting. And I think guesting is a really popular and positive way to promote your podcast. And I'm not saying go on as a guest and just talk about your podcast, but the more you're going on other shows and you're talking about who you are, what you do, your experiences, sharing your story, you have that opportunity to reach other audiences who may not be familiar with you or your work or what you do. So I think guesting is kind of not really thought about in a marketing perspective, but it really is one of the most effective marketing tools out there for podcasters.
Yeah, and it's something that even for myself, I've not considered so much, perhaps because I'm so busy anyway. But actually you're right in the sense that it's not just people on social media that you can convince, or people going to your website that you can convince, but you can also integrate yourself further into the wider community of people who are talking about books or talking about I don't know, being an author, all of those things, and being able to get involved and to improve your visibility overall is I think, through podcasting is not something that a lot of people tend to consider. But when we talk about hosting and actually having guests on, do you have any advice around that in terms of how to navigate having guests?
So for me, I would say make sure that your guests align with you and your mission and your audience and their vision and your values, and always have some sort of vetting process. So have a 15-minute call if it's somebody you connected with in a Facebook group. Have a 15-minute call with them, see what the vibe is like, see what they are offering your audience, because when you guest, it's not just about going on and talking about you and who you are and what you do. It's what value can you bring to the podcast host audience. So that's something really important. If it's not a good fit, it's okay to turn somebody away.
Yeah, no, I completely understand that. And actually, in terms of finding the guests, they are there for you to talk to, but you do have to be aligned with, once again, that core purpose of what story does this podcast tell? What value am I bringing to my listeners and how can this person contribute? So for example, we had a meeting before we came and did this podcast so that we knew, okay, so this is what we're talking about, and these are the points that we want to hit. And those 15-minute chats are incredibly useful, and they're also incredibly short, so you've got to pack them in really quick, but they can be really useful, and we've found that definitely. So for this podcast, you kindly offered to do an audit, and we've already kind of been through that and the outcomes of that, and so it's been incredibly useful. Thank you for that. What kinds of so if we kind of revisit that audit for a second, what pieces do you think stand out as actually these are common areas that people don't put enough emphasis on?
The funny thing is they're all different. So I haven't come across this common denominator in the audits that I do. But what we look at is everything. We go right to the beginning of what is your message? Who is your audience? What is the point of your podcast? What value do you want your listeners to get from this? And then we go back and see if your podcast is hitting those points. But we also look at everything from audio quality to cover art to episode descriptions, episode titles, SEO, and looking at the analytics. So when my husband and I do an audit, we're looking at everything, but it really all hinges on that foundational, what is your goal?
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing for people to take away is you're probably doing things well already,
Yes.
but there are tweaks and changes that can be made to help kind of nudge it slightly further in that direction that they're looking to go. And when you talk about SEO, search engine optimization, obviously that's quite a technical thing. Do authors need to worry too much about the SEO piece?
I would say don't get hung up on it. Don't let it hold you back. But if you already know what your keywords or your key phrases are, and you're able to work them into your episode descriptions or your episode titles, then absolutely do it. But if it's something that just feels a little too overwhelming for you right off the bat, and it's not something you're already doing, don't worry about it. You can learn and, like I said, learn and grow as you go. So don't freak out about it. But even when it comes to titling your book, a lot of people consider SEO in their book titles. So if it's something you're already aware of, sure, incorporate it into your titles and your descriptions if you can.
Yeah, because even an experienced marketer like myself, SEO it completely boggles my mind, and I have another person who is responsible for that. So yeah, basically, guys, it's not all that important. Like if you don't need it, it's fine. So let's go back to authors just for a second. So
Sure.
To help them start a podcast, are there any kind of useful resources that you might guide them to help them start that journey?
I actually have a free resource if anybody's interested that walks you through how to launch your podcast. It's very basic, but it is a great starting point that will give you the tools that you need to feel confident to be able to do it and start your show. So if you're interested in that, I have that. But there are obviously podcasts that I can send you after our conversation, and you can link them in the description, that I would recommend listening to if you're feeling like this is what I want to do, but I'm still feeling a little overwhelmed. So there are definitely resources out there, which I can send you afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll pop that into the description, as you say. And I think the challenge is with the internet, there's just so much out there that actually it can be difficult to filter those down into actually, helpful, actionable insights and resources that authors can use to help them. And you also offer, as you've mentioned, this kind of podcast management service. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that, just in case someone's interested?
Sure. So my husband and I, we work together as a podcast management team. We've been doing it since, 2022. I was a copywriter and nonfiction ghostwriter before we moved into this space, and I went through a podcast management course. My husband was a touring musician for 20 years, and writes music. So he's taken that audio skill and he handles all of the editing portion. So we do everything from helping people launch a podcast from scratch. We work with them. It's a collaborative process. We walk through everything from that foundational work to coming up with your episodes. If you need help coming up with the content, a launch strategy plan, you record your episodes, we edit them, we get the hosting platform set up for you, the distribution. So it's very hands-off from that perspective. You don't have to worry about what equipment do I need. We send you a mic and headphones as part of our package. My husband writes custom music for anybody who launches with us for that audio branding to separate them from I call it the sea of stock music out there. And then obviously at the end of our time together, they have the opportunity to continue working with us on the outsourced basis where we handle the show notes, the weekly editing, distribution, that sort of thing. But if they choose not to, we don't leave them high and dry. We walk them through exactly what they need to do to be able to upkeep their show going forward. And then obviously, as you mentioned, we do some podcast audits for existing podcasters who maybe feel like their show's a bit stagnant and are just wondering what they're doing well and where they can improve. And some what is the word? It escapes me, but that's basically what we do. We do some outsourced editing and that sort of thing.
Great stuff. And just about the audio piece then, because I was just thinking, well, is there a danger actually of podcasters starting afresh, looking for that kind of intro, outro jingle, that they might actually end up in trouble with kind of copywriting if they don't source it from the right place and get the right license? So, is that a problem?
So you can't use a popular song off the radio, anything off the top of the charts. You can't use that. You need to get permission from the artist, which it's not going to happen, or it's going to cost you a very pretty penny. So you're better off not going that avenue. There are stock libraries, like I mentioned. However, the issue that we find with that is, one, choice. You can really get caught up in the hundreds of thousands of tunes in the stock library that it gets to be a little overwhelming. What do I want? We also find that people tend to choose music that doesn't really reflect their brand or the tone of the show. We once had somebody approach us for music, and it was going to be a very serious topic. And the reference track they sent us was this very upbeat, poppy type track, and it didn't really quite resonate with what they wanted their show to be. So that's really, to me, important when listening or choosing your music. But yes, you're correct. If you go into the stock libraries, they have the license agreements for you. But when you work with us, our launch, Billy will write the music for you and provide the license fee to be able to use it. And what he does is he licenses it for you and your podcast. So he won't license it to another podcast. So you won't run into that issue of clicking on a podcast and, oh no, somebody else has your intro music. It's for you and you only. So it's kind of like that McDonald's identifier or Netflix identifier. So it's really for you and your podcast.
Yeah, I love that idea of audio branding. I think that's great. And obviously that extends as well into kind of your descriptions and your, the cover art and everything. So I imagine that it's really important as well to have a true understanding of the author's branding, as well as what they're trying to do with the podcast.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So we also have, that I think we should mention, the podcast to book blueprint mini course that you offer. And that was so intriguing to me because for us as the Book Tribe podcast, now you could tell me I'm wrong and that I've misunderstood what you mean by this, but there's so much content for us to pick from within even just the first season and now into the second season. So being able to turn a podcast into a book of sorts, it sounds like a really interesting thing to do. So can you just tell me a little bit more about that, please?
Sure. So the blueprint is more for established podcasters who already have a load of content under their belt, and it's just sitting there. They're not repurposing it. And maybe they wanted to write a book, but don't know how. Or maybe they are looking for those, like we've talked about, additional revenue streams. Well, your content is already there. Let's repurpose it into a book. But as you know, it's not just about copy and pasting your transcripts. It's about really what is the message, who is it for, and what existing content do I already have that I can use as a starting point to write a book. So I've created a mini course that walks you through exactly how to do that, from the foundations to mining that content. And then obviously I don't do the publishing side of things, but I know enough about it that I walk you through, here are the avenues now that you have your manuscript, here's how you can turn it into a book. So that's what the podcast to book blueprint is. And I've actually started incorporating this into the launch process for people who want to launch a podcast, that when we go over the content piece, we'll actually structure your content so you'll be able to repurpose it down the road if that's an avenue that you want to go down.
That sounds absolutely fascinating to me, and I'm going to have to look into this for myself, because I think that sounds brilliant. And perhaps, for maybe not fiction authors, but for non-fiction authors, there's something else there for them to kind of take their podcast and make it into a manuscript of a different type. But yeah, no, that sounds really fascinating. So thank you for sharing that. And looking ahead, so for podcasting in general, perhaps for authors, if that's relevant, what do you kind of see happening in podcasting? Where do you think it's going?
That's a great question. It is just booming. I know, and to that, it feels like everybody and their brother has a podcast. So sometimes that gets in your head too. Like, will anybody listen to me? Because there's so many podcasts out there. The thing is, if you actually go and look at the stats and you look at the numbers, there's something like 5 million podcasts that exist, but only, I can't remember what the stat is off the top of my head, so you'd have to double check. But it's something like 500,000 are active. And that's because when it comes to that outsourcing, the editing, the people are taking on more than they can chew at the time, and they don't realize it, and then they just give up on it. So one, that's why I think outsourcing when you can is really important, and not taking on too much. If you feel like putting out weekly episodes is too much for you, just because you see a lot of other people doing it, doesn't mean you have to. You can do bi-weekly, you can do once a month, you can batch, you can do what works for you. But don't look at those numbers and feel like, whoa, there's 5 million podcasts out there. Who is going to listen to mine? The quote unquote competition is much less than it appears. And like I said, for fiction authors, I feel like there's a really untapped market here. So I only see podcasting continue to grow, and not just the audio part, but the video. And even if you don't want to be on camera, if you don't want to do in-person video interviews, you can still have a static image on YouTube and just have your podcast in another place, another opportunity, because YouTube is the second biggest search engine next to Google. So take advantage of it, even if you don't want to do an on-camera interview or an on-camera podcast. Put a static image with your audio and just be in another place.
Yeah, no, and as you say, I think Google, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, they're all, they've got big audience groups and huge user bases. So, someone will find you. And and I think actually for me personally, from the experience that I've had, TikTok and YouTube Shorts have been some of the biggest places where we've had the most visibility. So even to use that as a trailer into what it is that you're doing, into the longer videos, is enough to kind of tease the value of that if you're doing, I don't know, not a private account, but maybe one of the more public podcasts, to kind of talk about bigger topics and to, draw people in, or even as a teaser for the private channel, I don't know, but they're great tools and they're there, and it seems like a wasted opportunity to not post something there if you can't. So one final question then, Sarah. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been great to talk to you, and I'm sure there's so much more that we could actually talk about when it comes to podcasts. But do you have any sort of advice for authors who are trying to perhaps sell their books and build a business for their writing?
I would say, even if you don't feel hosting your own show is for you right now, definitely consider going the guesting route, because I think that is a huge opportunity for you to be able to reach new audiences. And I know we touched upon it a little bit earlier, but I do want to say that it doesn't even necessarily have to be guesting about your book or your author journey. Sometimes there's just an opportunity to talk about a personal experience or a story or something that you're passionate about, and you can get on another podcast and dive into that, and people will find you through that. So it doesn't always have to be related to your book or what you do as an author. People connect with you as a person, and from there, that's when that interest in, they also write books, it can spark that interest as well. So I would say, even if you don't want to be a host, definitely consider guesting in some fashion.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. After the conversation that we've had, I think, there's an easy step here, which is to guest, and then if you feel that that's the right path for you, then maybe doing a podcast is the next step to that. But then I think all of this comes back down to what we were speaking about at the very, very beginning of this discussion, which is you've got to understand who your audience is and why should they want to listen to you, what value are you bringing to them, and then that can really help to kind of build a more defined picture of how your podcast will shape, where you're hosting it, how you're promoting it, all of those things. It really means that you can narrow down on those sorts of questions. So Sarah, thank you again for today. We'll be sharing the link to your website and also to your Instagram accounts and the additional resources that you'll kindly send us after this in the podcast description. And for anyone who is listening and would like to hear more from literary, publishing and marketing experts, make sure to subscribe to the Book Tribe channel, or join the Book Tribe author community, where you can connect with our network of author service partners and make connections with other authors. But Sarah, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.